Here we are, last section in Unit 6, and it is all about graphing some more. Here we have looked at this equation for the last several days, and we concentrated on mostly a sine of bx, and we've kind of ignored c and just done a little bit with d. All right, so just again, defining what these mean, the amplitude is A, and the amplitude is a stretch of the function. And we know a vertical shift, that is the D part of this. And the phase shift, and this is something that we haven't talked about, is the C value, how a graph will move left or right over the x-axis. And there's a special symbol for phase shift, and it's called phi, the Greek letter phi, and it's defined by the opposite of the C value over B. All right, so B is still going to tell us how long our period is, but the shift is going to be minus C over B. So basically, if C is positive, you're going to shift right. I'm sorry, you're going to shift left. And if C is negative, okay, just like all the other functions we've done, if this is minus C, you're going to go in the positive direction, so you're going to shift right. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of these and define all of these symbols. I'm just going to kind of talk through some of the graphs. I think it's better if we not worry about what all of this means in terms of vocabulary and everything, but it's more of the process. So as we've been doing, first thing we do is define the amplitude. And the amplitude in this graph would be 3. It's a sine function. Our period, or the length that it takes to do one cycle, is still 2 pi over b. In this case, it's 2 pi over 2, or just pi. And then we're putting in this, actually it's more like this. This actually, I don't want it to look like the null set or no solution. But this again, if we look back up here, is the opposite of C over B. So in this case, C is minus pi, so we're going to have plus pi over B, which is 2. All right, so this means I'm going to move it to the right pi over 2 spaces. All right, so let's get a graph going here. And because I need an amplitude of 3, 1, 2, 3, I don't have any up or down shift, so I know that all of my sine graph is going to be between 3 and negative 3. I am going to shift over to pi over 2, and then from pi over 2, my period is 1 whole pi. So here is pi over 2. Let's say this is pi, and to get a full pi, I need 3 pi over 2. This is 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, or just pi, and 3 pi over 2. And I'm looking for the distance between where I'm starting my shift and where I end my shift. So I can find that out by looking at my shift. Okay, so this is going to be my start value, is the pi over 2. And I'm going to go to my ending value, which is going to be my start value, pi over 2, plus my period, which is just pi. So this is the length of one cycle. Now remember, I do need to put in my 5 important points. So halfway between pi over 2 and pi is 3 pi over 4. And pi and 3 pi over 2 would be 5 pi over 4. Okay, if we were counting in quarters. So now we are going to start. If I have the sine graph, remember these are my 5 points, and I'm going to start and end with the same point. And for sine, I'm starting at 0, I'm ending at 0, and then I have pi as another x-intercept. And the next point will be up, and my altitude is 3. And this last point down here is going to be down at my altitude of -3, amplitude, I'm sorry. So this is what one cycle of this is going to look like. All right, so this is the sine of 3 times the sine of 2x minus pi. All right, so let's do another one. Let's do a couple more and then maybe save one for class. So the next one is y equals 3. This time I have cosine of 4x plus pi and then plus 1. All right, so I have an amplitude of 3, and my period or my time is 2 pi over b, and b is 4 here. So this would be 1/2 pi, or pi over 2. And now my phase shift. My phase shift is going to be the opposite of c over b. All right, so the opposite of c is, the c value is pi, so I have -pi over 4. All right, so this is where I'm going to start my graph. So I'm going to start at -pi over 4. I'm going to end at -pi over 4 plus my period, which is pi over 2. If I add these together, I'm going to get positive pi over 4. All right, so here's my graph. And by the way, once I get this, I'll do this once I get this label. So I'm going to go from -pi over 4 to positive pi over 4. And then I need to have my other 2 points here. I got 0 in between here. Let's say that this one is half of pi over 4, which is -pi over 8. And this one is just pi over 8. So here's my 5 points that I'm going to plot here. Now my altitude, amplitude, I swear I get it wrong every time, all right, are both 3. So if I'm looking at cosine, I'm going to start at 3, but I'm actually going to move this up 1. So this is my point. The next point at cosine would be, let's see, let's do this before the shift. So I start at 1, I come down here at pi over 8, and then I go down to negative 1, which would be 3, and then I come back to pi over 8, and then back to pi over 4. Let's do this in another color. So this point, I'm going to shift up 1. This point, I'm going to shift up 1, shift up 1 for each of these, and my graph will look something like this. Okay. And the last one. How about I do example 3 in class? I think that's kind of the hardest one. So we'll do that one in class together. So here we have on example 4, we have a cosine graph again. My amplitude is the absolute value of -2, which is 2, but I want to make a note here that I'm going to flip. My period for cosine is 2 pi over b. My b value is 2, so 2 pi over 2, which is pi. And then I'm going to have my shift. So I got opposite of c over b. The c value is pi over 2, so I'm going to have the opposite of negative pi over 2, which is positive pi over 2. And that's going to be over b, which is divided by 2, or multiplied by 1/2. So this is going to be pi over 4. So this is where I'm going to start at pi over 4, and I'm going to end at pi over 4 plus pi. So that would be 5 pi over 4. Let's look and see what that looks like. All right, I have no shift on this, so I know I'm going to go from 2 to -2. I'm going to start at pi over 4, and I'm going to go to 5 pi over 4, and this is going to be the length of this is going to be 1 pi. Okay, pi over 4 to 5 pi over 4. But now I need to identify what those points are, and to do that I need to find the midpoint between these two. So I'm going to add them up. So I have 6 pi over 4, and I'm going to divide it by 2 or multiply by 1/2. So this would be 3 pi over 4 in the middle, and that makes sense. 1 pi over 4, 3 pi, 5 pi, same denominator. So now I have halfway in between that. So I have 1 pi over 4 plus 3 pi over 4 is 4 pi over 4, and I'm going to divide that by 2. So this is pi. And if I divide by 2, I get pi over 2. So this is pi over 2. And this must be 3 pi. Let's do this. So this must be pi. So if I add 5 and 3 is 8 pi over 4, that's 2 pi. and then the average of that would be 1 pi. All right, so add them up, divide by 2 for each of these sections. All right, so I'm going to flip cosine. If this were cosine, my first point would be up here, but I'm going to flip it so it's down here. And then my next point is at the axis. My middle point is at the maximum, back to the axis, and then back to the minimum. So it's going to look like this. And like I said, we will save this middle problem for class. All right.